Fashion has always been a curious mirror of human behavior. It reflects not only what people find beautiful, but also what societies, cultures, and classes expect from one another. The Middle Ages, often remembered for knights in shining armor, towering castles, and sweeping cathedrals, was also a time of experimentation. Sometimes bold, sometimes bizarre, and occasionally downright embarrassing. Medieval clothing often stretched the boundaries of practicality and sensibility, turning everyday garments into spectacles that drew both admiration and ridicule. And while some of these styles were born from status or vanity, others were tied to symbolism, superstition, or the desire to be remembered as different. In this journey, we will walk slowly through some of the strangest and most embarrassing trends from medieval fashion. Some may make you laugh, others may leave you puzzled, but all of them tell us something about the human condition, our longing to impress, to belong, and to stand out, even if it meant walking down the street in shoes longer than your arm, or hats so tall they could scrape a doorway. Let us begin with one of the most notorious and often mocked fashion statements of the Middle Ages, the poulain, or elongated shoe. Section 1. The curious case of the poulains, shoes too long for walking. Imagine stepping into a bustling medieval marketplace, the air filled with the scent of roasted meats and the chatter of merchants selling their wares. Suddenly, from the corner of your eye, you notice a man of wealth gliding, or perhaps stumbling, through the crowd. His shoes stretch nearly half a meter in front of him, the tips curling upward like the beak of a great bird. These, dear listener, are poulains, long, pointed shoes that became one of the most iconic and embarrassing fashions of the later Middle Ages. The poulain first gained popularity in 14th century Poland, hence the name, derived from Polish style. From there, the trend swept across Europe like wildfire, especially in France and England, where nobles embraced it as a sign of wealth and distinction. At its peak, the points of these shoes grew so exaggerated that men would tie them to their knees with strings just to keep from tripping. It is easy to imagine how impractical this was. Walking, running, even climbing stairs turned into feats of balance and patience. Yet the longer and more dramatic the shoe, the greater the prestige. What made them such a spectacle was the symbolism they carried. In a world where clothing often reflected social status, the exaggerated length of a man's shoe was seen as a display of his leisure and rank. A farmer could never wear such shoes while working the fields. Only the wealthy could afford to glide about, unbothered by manual labor, showing off their elaborate footwear in courts and feasts. In fact, certain records suggest that the length of a shoe's point sometimes corresponded to the wearer's class. Small points for commoners, longer ones for nobility, and the most exaggerated lengths for royalty. Naturally, not everyone found this appealing. Clergy and moralists of the time considered poulain shoes frivolous and indecent. Preachers accused them of vanity, even sin, likening their absurdity to prideful peacocks. In some places, authority stepped in with sumptuary laws, rules dictating what people could or could not wear based on their class, to limit the length of these shoes. Yet, like all forbidden fruit, the restrictions only made them more desirable. The more critics complained, the longer and more flamboyant the shoes became. There were also, as you might expect, practical consequences. Contemporary chronicles tell of knights who struggled to mount their horses while wearing poulains. Others stumbled in battle, their absurd footwear catching on uneven ground. In some regions, the points were stuffed with moss or horsehair to give them shape, and at times they were reinforced with whalebone or metal, making them stiff and heavy. Imagine carrying such contraptions at your feet, shoes not designed for movement, but for spectacle, like medieval runway fashion. Looking back now, it is hard not to smile at the irony. Something so utterly impractical became the pinnacle of elegance, a way of saying, "Look at me. I am important enough to wear shoes that hinder my very ability to walk." Today, we may shake our heads at such extravagance, but the Poulain was a powerful reminder that fashion is rarely about utility. It is about status, identity, and sometimes sheer absurdity. And yet, there's also something strangely human about it. Just as people today might endure uncomfortable heels or stiff suits in the name of style, medieval nobles endured the trials of their elongated shoes for the sake of appearances. It was embarrassing, yes, but it was also deeply relatable. Fashion, it seems, has always been about balancing the delicate line between pride and practicality. So, as we leave behind the clicking sound of those long shoes on cobblestones, let us take a breath and prepare to explore another strange and somewhat laughable medieval fashion. A trend that took vanity to even greater heights, quite literally. The towering hennin headdress. Section 2. The towering hennin. Hats that reached for the heavens. Step now, if you will, into a grand medieval court, lit by flickering torches and filled with the shimmering silks of nobles. Among the gowns and glittering jewelry, one sight immediately steals your breath away. Women moving gracefully, their heads adorned with enormous, cone-shaped headdresses that seem to scrape the very ceiling. These, dear listener, are the hennins, perhaps the most iconic and ridiculed fashion statements of medieval Europe. The hennin first rose to popularity in the 15th century, particularly in Burgundy, one of the wealthiest and most influential regions of the time. At its core, the hennin was essentially a cone or steeple-shaped hat, often draped with gauzy veils that flowed down dramatically behind the wearer. But what made them truly unforgettable was their sheer size. Some hennins towered up to 3 feet high, creating a silhouette so extreme that women could barely pass through doorways without bowing their heads. The very shape of the hennin was not accidental. Pointed toward the sky, it symbolized both refinement and aspiration, as if the wearer herself were reaching towards something celestial. For women of the court, the hennin became a sign of elegance, wealth, and sophistication. Its size alone was proof that she did not need to labor in fields or kitchens. She lived a life of leisure, free to balance such architectural wonders upon her head. But here is where embarrassment enters the story. While many in the nobility adored the hennin, common folk and moralists often mocked it. Satirical drawings of the period exaggerate hennins to ridiculous heights, lampooning their wearers as vain and foolish. Clergy denounced them as symbols of pride, a sin that threatened to pull women away from humility. One preacher in particular described them as horns of the devil, condemning both the shape and the arrogance they implied. The hennin, in the eyes of critics, was not only impractical but also indecent, a beacon of vanity atop the female head. Indeed, the hennin was impractical in every sense. Imagine trying to dine, to bend, to embrace a friend while balancing a steeple rising from your skull. Passing through low doors or riding in a carriage became comical affairs, with ladies ducking and twisting their necks to save their fragile headdresses from collapse. Servants were often tasked with ensuring that veils did not tangle or catch on nearby objects. Even wind was an enemy. threatening to send gauzy fabrics fluttering wildly about a woman's face. Yet despite the laughter and criticism, hennins remained wildly fashionable. Why? Because they achieved their purpose. They drew attention. A woman wearing a hennin was impossible to ignore. At courtly gatherings, the tallest and most elaborately decorated hennins belonged to those of the highest rank, reinforcing the social ladder quite literally above everyone's heads. Silk veils, jewels, gold embroidery. These were not just accessories, but declarations of status. There were variations, too. The truncated hennin was a cone with its tip chopped off flat, while the more classic steeple hennin rose to dizzying points. Some were paired with wimples that framed the face, while others allowed veils to cascade dramatically down the back, sometimes reaching all the way to the ground. And for those who could afford it, hennins were covered in fine fabrics imported from far-off lands, their exotic materials whispering tales of wealth and influence. Despite their popularity, hennins also became the subject of regulation. Just as with the poulain shoes, sumptuary laws sometimes restricted the size and extravagance of headdresses based on class. In England, for example, certain heights were reserved for noblewomen, while common women were barred from imitating them. These laws attempted to maintain visible boundaries between the classes, but they also fueled desire. After all, what better way to show off one's privilege than to wear something forbidden to others? The hennin's legacy is fascinating because it embodies so much of what makes medieval fashion both laughable and profoundly human. On one hand, it was deeply impractical, often mocked, and seen as a source of embarrassment. On the other, it reflected ambition, artistry, and the yearning for recognition. It turned the wearer into a walking spectacle, a living tower of fabric and pride. Today, the hennin survives mostly in caricature and costume. If you picture a princess from a fairy tale, chances are she wears a tall cone-shaped hat with a trailing veil, an echo of this medieval fashion trend. But behind the fantasy lies the reality. Countless women balancing enormous hats, enduring stares and criticism, all in pursuit of beauty and social standing. When we laugh at the hennin now, perhaps we should pause and reflect. Is it truly so different from towering high heels, oversized sunglasses, or elaborate hairstyles of modern times? Each era has its peculiar extremes, its fashions that push the limits of practicality for the sake of attention and prestige. The hennin reminds us that fashion is cyclical. It changes, but it always returns to the same core desire: the wish to stand out, to be admired, to be remembered. And so we leave behind these towering hats, the gauzy veils billowing in candlelight, and turn our gaze to another curious chapter of embarrassing medieval fashion. This time we will descend from the head to the waist and examine a trend that was as tight as the hennin was tall: the snug, sometimes laughably revealing, codpiece. Section 3. The codpiece. A bold and awkward statement. If the hennin represented women reaching for the heavens in the Middle Ages, then the codpiece was the men's answer, though its direction was decidedly less celestial. Few garments in history have provoked as much laughter, discomfort, and eyebrow-raising as the codpiece, that peculiar fashion accessory designed to cover, exaggerate, and draw attention to the male anatomy. In its time, it was seen as practical, fashionable, and even powerful. To us today, it is often remembered as one of the most bizarre and embarrassing fashion trends of the medieval and Renaissance world. The codpiece began its story in the 15th century, a period when men's clothing underwent a transformation. Men of the late Middle Ages often wore long tunics, which covered much of the body down to the knees. But as styles shifted toward shorter doublets and hose, those tight-fitting leggings that revealed the shape of the legs, a problem emerged. The hose were often made as two separate pieces, one for each leg, tied to the doublet at the waist. This left an awkward gap in the middle, directly at the crotch. To leave it uncovered would be indecent. To cover it poorly would be laughable. And so the codpiece was born. At first, simply a triangular or pouch-like piece of cloth to close the gap modestly. But as so often happens in the world of fashion, practicality quickly gave way to extravagance. By the 16th century, the codpiece had grown larger, bolder, and more ornate. No longer just a modest covering, but a proud centerpiece of a man's attire. Stuffed with padding, stiffened with fabric, sometimes even lined with wood or metal, codpieces were designed not to hide, but to flaunt. They were embroidered with gold thread, adorned with jewels or dyed in vibrant colors to draw the eye. What began as a solution to a tailoring problem had become a stage for masculine bravado. Why, you might ask, would men willingly emphasize such a detail of their body in public? Part of the answer lies in symbolism. In a society where lineage, power, and fertility were prized, the codpiece became a visual statement of virility. To wear a large, ostentatious codpiece was to declare oneself strong, potent, and capable of producing heirs. It was clothing as propaganda, broadcasting not only wealth, but also masculine confidence. Famous figures of the time are often depicted wearing codpieces in their portraits. King Henry VIII of England, in particular, is almost inseparable from the image of a padded codpiece. His portraits show him standing with legs apart, codpiece front and center, as much a symbol of his authority as his crown or scepter. For Henry, who sought to project strength and fertility despite his struggles to produce a male heir, the codpiece was more than just fashion. It was a statement of kingship itself. Yet the codpiece was not without its critics. Just as the hennin had been mocked by satirists and preachers, so too was the codpiece. Writers of the time derided it as vulgar, a laughable exaggeration of masculinity. Plays and poems often used it as a symbol of foolishness, poking fun at men who padded theirs to absurd proportions. Clergymen condemned it as indecent, an outward sign of lust and pride. In some cases, laws were proposed to restrict their size or decoration, though such rules were often ignored by wealthy nobles eager to show off. Beyond its role as a fashion accessory, the codpiece even took on a practical use in certain contexts. Some were designed to open and close with buttons or ties, functioning as a kind of early fly for ease of relieving oneself. Others were used, somewhat alarmingly, to store small items like coins or handkerchiefs. A man might reach into his codpiece, not for flirtation, but to pay for a drink. This practical function, however, only added to the mix of comedy and discomfort that surrounded the garment. Despite its popularity for over a century, the codpiece's reign did not last forever. By the late 16th century, styles shifted again. Men's doublets became longer, covering the midsection, and the codpiece gradually shrank before disappearing altogether. By the 17th century, it was largely seen as a relic of the past, an object of mockery rather than admiration. Satirical prints from later eras often exaggerated codpieces to grotesque proportions, lampooning the vanity of men who once wore them proudly. What makes the codpiece so fascinating and so embarrassing in hindsight is how directly it confronted one of the most private aspects of human life. Most fashions, however impractical, are meant to flatter or elevate the wearer subtly. The codpiece, by contrast, was a blunt proclamation. It dared people to look, dared them to judge, and dared men to compete in size and extravagance. In doing so, it revealed as much about cultural values as it did about individual egos. To modern eyes, the codpiece may seem laughable, but perhaps it is not so distant from trends we know today. Muscle-enhancing suits, bulging athletic wear, or even certain flashy cars and accessories might serve a similar purpose. Signals of power, virility, or status, wrapped in material form. Fashion has always been about more than covering the body. It is about communication, performance, and identity. The codpiece was all of these, compressed into one audacious garment. So, as we leave behind this strange chapter of men's fashion, let us picture once more the courts of Europe. Men striding confidently, their codpieces gleaming with gold thread, their heads held high, while common folk snickered behind their backs. It was bold, it was absurd, and it was utterly unforgettable. From here, our journey into embarrassing medieval fashions continues, not with men's attire, but with garments that bound and reshaped the body itself. For our next stop, we turn to the world of tight-laced corsets and girdles, where beauty came at the cost of comfort, and vanity squeezed as tightly as bone and fabric would allow. Section 4. Corsets and girdles when fashion became a cage. In the Middle Ages, beauty standards were as relentless as they are today, though the ideals were strikingly different. While modern culture often idolizes slim waists and toned physiques through gym routines and photo filters, medieval society had its own tools for shaping the body, and they were far less forgiving. Among the strangest and most enduring trends of this era were the corset's ancestors, tightly laced girdles and stiffened bodices that compressed, constrained, and reshaped the wearer's figure. What we see as elegant in portraits of noble women often came at the cost of comfort, health, and freedom of movement. At first glance, the girdle does not sound particularly bizarre. In its earliest forms, it was little more than a belt or a simple supportive band of fabric tied around the waist. Used as early as the 12th century, the girdle served a practical function. It held clothing in place, offered some support to the lower back, and sometimes symbolized wealth if it was adorned with fine embroidery, silver buckles, or even jewels. Monks and priests wore plain girdles as part of their religious attire, symbolizing chastity and discipline. For women, however, the girdle took on a more restrictive and aesthetic role as time went on. By the 14th and 15th centuries, ideals of female beauty had shifted dramatically. The preferred silhouette was a long, slender torso with a narrow waist that emphasized the hips and bust. This figure was not something every woman could naturally achieve, so fashion provided an answer. Tightly laced garments, reinforced with stiff fabrics, cords, and sometimes even whalebone or wood, that pulled the body into the desired shape. Early corsets and girdles were not quite the steel-framed contraptions of the Renaissance and Victorian eras, but they represented the beginning of a long history of women literally binding themselves to beauty. The process of wearing these garments was itself an ordeal. To achieve the tightly cinched waist, women often required assistance. A maid or servant would tug at the laces, pulling harder and harder, until the fabric compressed the torso into the fashionable line of the time. Breathing deeply became difficult, and bending at the waist nearly impossible. While men's codpieces exaggerated masculinity in a bold, almost comical display, women's girdles worked quietly and invisibly, transforming their bodies into living sculptures. Yet, despite the discomfort, these garments were deeply symbolic. A tightly laced waist suggested discipline, control, and moral uprightness. Just as the girdle held the body firmly in place, so too did it suggest a woman's restraint in behavior and sexuality, at least according to the ideals promoted by moralists and poets. In medieval literature, a lady girdled was often portrayed as virtuous, chaste, and well-mannered, while a loosened girdle hinted at loosened morals. Fashion was not only about beauty, it was a language of virtue and vice. For noble women, a beautiful girdle could also serve as a dazzling display of wealth. Some were studded with precious stones, or crafted from velvet and silk, meant to be glimpsed beneath fine gowns. A wealthy lady's girdle might cost more than a peasant family's annual income. Even men wore decorative girdles, often as part of ceremonial armor or courtly attire, though theirs were looser, practical, and far less restrictive. As the Middle Ages turned toward the Renaissance, the corset began to evolve further, becoming stiffer, more elaborate, and some would say, more punishing. Reports from the late 15th century describe women fainting from restricted breathing or suffering digestive issues caused by prolonged compression. Physicians sometimes warned against the practice, though their warnings often went unheeded, drowned out by the demands of fashion. For many women, the discomfort was a price worth paying for social standing, admiration, and the chance to conform to ideals celebrated in art and poetry. Of course, not everyone embraced the trend. Just as satirists mocked codpieces, writers occasionally poked fun at women squeezed so tightly into their bodices that they could barely walk. Some even claimed the fashion was dangerous to fertility, a curious contrast to the codpiece, which loudly proclaimed virility. In a world where most people labored in fields, carried heavy loads, or worked with their hands, the sight of a noble woman bound tightly in layers of cloth and whalebone must have seemed both absurd and impractical. And yet, these garments did more than restrict. They reshaped not only the body, but the way women carried themselves. With the torso immobilized, the shoulders drawn back, and the waist compressed, a woman's movements became slower, more deliberate, almost theatrical. In courtly settings, this was part of the allure. Restriction was elegance. Difficulty became dignity. To glide across a hall with a rigid waist was to demonstrate refinement, wealth, and the luxury of not needing to labor like common folk. Looking back today, it is hard not to see the irony. Men flaunted their strength and potency with padded codpieces, while women diminished their comfort and mobility to embody chastity and discipline. Both fashions were exaggerated, both strange, and both embarrassing in their own way. They remind us that clothing has always been more than fabric. It has been a mirror of culture's deepest anxieties and aspirations. The girdle and early corset would go on to influence centuries of fashion, peaking in the tightly cinched waists of the Renaissance and Victorian eras, and eventually sparking fierce debates about women's health and liberation. But in the Middle Ages, they stood as a curious mixture of practicality, beauty, and bondage, symbols of elegance achieved through discomfort, and of virtue displayed through restriction. So when we look at medieval portraits of women with impossibly slim waists and graceful postures, we should remember the hidden reality beneath the gowns. Laces pulled tight, breath drawn shallow, and bodies molded to meet ideals that were both admired and imposed. From here, our journey into strange medieval fashions takes us away from the waistline and into the world of footwear. Our next stop, the pointed shoes, or poulaines, so absurdly long that wearers had to tie the tips to their knees just to walk. Section 5. The longest shoes ever worn. If there is one medieval fashion that perfectly balances elegance with absurdity, it is the pointed shoe, better known by its French nickname, the poulaine. These shoes, popular from the 14th to 15th centuries, featured elongated, needle-like toes that sometimes stretched over half a meter beyond the actual foot. Imagine trying to walk with shoelaces tied to a pair of rulers strapped to your toes, and you'll have a fair idea of the effect. The origin of the poulaine lies in Poland, where similar long-toed shoes first appeared. French and English nobles adopted the style eagerly, transforming it into a bold fashion statement. For wealthy men in particular, the longer the point, the greater the prestige. Some shoes were so exaggerated that the tips had to be stuffed with moss or horsehair to keep them upright. Others were reinforced with wire or whalebone. In extreme cases, the tips were tied to the knees with little chains or ribbons to stop the toes from dragging on the ground. These shoes weren't practical. Walking required careful, almost mincing steps, and running was out of the question. Riding a horse in poulaines could be hazardous, since the long tips might slip through stirrups and trap the rider's foot. Yet none of this stopped the nobility from embracing them. To wear poulaines was to announce that you had no need for speed, labor, or practicality. They were the footwear of luxury, the medieval equivalent of designer heels so high they defy physics. As with codpieces and corsets, the poulaine's exaggerated form carried social symbolism. A long shoe suggested not only wealth, but also virility. Chroniclers of the time often linked the shoe's absurd extension to male sexual pride, a point not lost on critics and satirists. Clergymen, in particular, condemned the style as sinful and indecent. One preacher in the 15th century railed against poulaines as the devil's claws, designed to lead men astray with pride and vanity. Despite criticism, the style spread widely. By the late 14th century, men and women across Europe were wearing them, though men's shoes tended to be the most exaggerated. Nobles competed with one another for the longest toes, creating what some historians jokingly describe as shoe-length contests. Records suggest that the most extreme poulaines reached lengths of nearly 24 inches, over 60 centimeters, long enough that the shoe became more weapon than garment. Naturally, the practical-minded authorities tried to rein things in. Several cities issued laws restricting the length of shoe points. In 1463, for example, England's King Edward IV decreed that no one below the rank of gentleman could wear shoes with points longer than 2 inches. Higher-ranking men were allowed longer tits, but even they had limits. These sumptuary laws show how footwear had become a battleground of class identity. Your shoe's absurd length was a visible marker of your place in the social hierarchy. For ordinary people who needed to work, farm, or fight, poulaines were less common and far shorter. Practical leather boots or simple turn shoes remained the norm for peasants and soldiers, but in courts and noble households, the poulaine reigned supreme. Portraits of fashionable men and women from the era often show them standing stiffly in their long pointed shoes, symbols of elegance and extravagance that future generations would find almost laughable. Indeed, laugh they did. Satirists mocked poulains relentlessly. One popular joke imagined men tripping over their own toes. Another described a suitor unable to approach his beloved because his shoe points kept poking her from across the room. Even centuries later, historians and costume enthusiasts marvel at the impracticality. They serve as a reminder that fashion has always walked a fine line between beauty and ridiculousness. By the late 15th century, the poulain craze faded. Practicality finally won out as shorter, broader shoes became fashionable once more. But their legacy lingers in museum collections and illuminated manuscripts, where the exaggerated shoes still provoke both amusement and fascination. When we picture a medieval noble gliding through a castle hall in a stiff gown or padded tunic, it's worth imagining the hidden struggle beneath the elegance. A tightly laced girdle might restrict the breath, while on the feet, absurdly long shoes turned every step into a balancing act. Taken together, they remind us that medieval beauty often came at the cost of mobility, comfort, and practicality. The poulain may not have survived the test of time, but its spirit lives on. Modern fashion still produces styles that defy logic. Impossibly high stilettos, oversized sneakers, and runway outfits that no one could actually wear in daily life. The medieval pointed shoe fits perfectly in this long tradition of humanity's love for the extravagant and the impractical. Our next chapter takes us away from shoes and into a world even stranger: medieval cosmetics and beauty practices. From toxic powders to bizarre concoctions, these reveal just how far people were willing to go to meet the ideals of beauty in their time. Section 6: Strange Medieval Cosmetics and Beauty Practices. Fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't only about clothing and shoes. It was also about the face and skin that peeked out from beneath the layers of fabric. Just as nobles flaunted long shoes or enormous sleeves, they also sought to shape their appearances according to the ideals of beauty of their time. And as you might guess, the methods they used could be both bizarre and, by our standards, a little alarming. For noble women in particular, pale, flawless skin was considered the pinnacle of beauty. A face without blemish suggested not only refinement, but also a life sheltered from the harsh sun of outdoor labor. Peasants were tanned because they worked the fields. Aristocrats were fair because they did not. To achieve this ideal, women turned to cosmetics, though the recipes were far from safe. One common practice was applying mixtures that included lead-based powders. These powders, dusted across the cheeks and forehead, brightened the skin temporarily, but slowly poisoned it in the long term. The pursuit of beauty, quite literally, came at a deadly cost. Beyond lead, other strange concoctions were used. Some women rubbed ground-up alabaster stone or chalk on their faces, creating a ghostly pale mask. Others applied mixtures made from animal fats combined with herbs and crushed minerals. While some herbs may have had soothing effects, the heavy pastes often clogged the skin, creating more blemishes, the very thing the cosmetics were meant to hide. Still, the look was prized. Women gazed into polished metal mirrors, carefully adjusting their painted faces to achieve a soft, pale glow. Eyebrows and hairlines were another focal point of medieval beauty. The high forehead was especially fashionable. To achieve this, women sometimes plucked their hairlines back several inches, creating the illusion of a longer brow and a more intellectual, refined appearance. Eyebrows were plucked thin or even removed entirely. It was not uncommon for noblewomen to sit patiently while attendants carefully pulled hair strand by strand, leaving the skin reddened and sore. To us, the result might appear strange or even unsettling, but at the time, it was considered elegant. Rouge, too, had its place, while pale skin was the foundation. A faint blush was added to the cheeks and lips. Recipes varied, but many included ingredients like crushed berries, madder root, or cinnabar, a mercury-based mineral. Once again, beauty was bought with risk. Cinnabar gave a rich rosy hue but was highly toxic. Still, the subtle flush created by these paints contrasted beautifully with the powdered pallor of the skin. It gave the face a sense of vitality while maintaining the aristocratic ideal of fairness. Eyes were also enhanced. Some medieval women darkened their lashes and brows using soot or powdered antimony. These substances created dramatic, dark outlines around the eyes, giving them greater definition. Yet, much like modern eyeliner gone awry, the practice could smudge, leaving streaks down the face in heat or rain. There are even accounts of concoctions involving belladonna, a poisonous plant, which women used to dilate their pupils and give their eyes a dreamy, wide-eyed look. The name belladonna means beautiful lady for this very reason, though the plant could cause blindness if used too often. Men, too, engaged in cosmetic practices, though their goals differed. While women aimed for softness and delicacy, men often sought to appear vigorous and strong. Dyes were sometimes used to darken beards or hair, hiding gray and maintaining a youthful look. Some knights or noblemen even wore scented oils and balms on their skin, both for fragrance and to present an image of refinement. Of course, not everyone approved of these practices. Clergy frequently criticized cosmetics, condemning them as vanity and deceit. Religious preachers warned that painting one's face was a way of disguising the natural body God had given, and thus a form of sin. Satirical writings poked fun at women who painted their cheeks too heavily or plucked their eyebrows too far back. Yet, the very existence of these criticisms shows how widespread the practices were. After all, no one bothers to rail against something unless it is common. For those who could not afford costly powders or imported minerals, simpler remedies were tried. Village girls sometimes rubbed strawberries or beet juice onto their cheeks to mimic a healthy blush. Others relied on natural oils, not to paint the skin, but to give it a smoother sheen. These homemade efforts may have lacked the luxury of lead powders or cinnabar rouge, but they achieved the same purpose: to shape the face according to the ideals of beauty at the time. Looking back, medieval cosmetics strike us as a blend of creativity and danger. People were willing to endure plucking, smearing, and even poisoning themselves to chase after ideals that seem strange to us now. When we think about the lengths people go to in modern beauty routines, from chemical peels to injections, it becomes clear that the impulse is the same. Across the centuries, humans have always been willing to suffer discomfort, even harm, in the name of beauty. In the grand fashion story of the Middle Ages, These cosmetics formed just one chapter. They complemented the extravagant clothes, shoes, and hairstyles, creating a complete image of elegance, sometimes laughable, sometimes haunting, but always fascinating. Next, we turn from the face to something even more dramatic. Section 7. Towering Hats and Wild Headgear, where we'll explore how medieval people turned their very heads into canvases for fashion statements. Section 7. Towering Hats and Wild Headgear. If medieval fashion had one accessory that truly stretched the limits of imagination, it was the hat. Hats in the Middle Ages were not simply practical coverings for warmth or shade. They were statements, declarations of identity, wealth, and status. And sometimes they were downright bizarre. Looking at the headgear of this period feels almost like stepping into a world of theatrical costume, where taller, bigger, and more extravagant often meant better. One of the most famous, and perhaps most mocked, forms of medieval headwear was the hennin. You've probably seen it in old fairy tale illustrations. The tall, cone-shaped hat worn by noblewomen, often with a long veil flowing from its tip. At its simplest, the hennin might rise only a foot or so above the head, but the most extravagant examples could reach 3 feet high, swaying slightly with every step. These hats were stiffened with wire and cloth, sometimes padded to keep their shape. Draped veils of silk or fine linen trailed down the back, catching the wind like banners. Wearing one was no simple feat. You had to balance carefully, and sitting in a chair with a high back was nearly impossible. The hennin wasn't merely decorative, it was a symbol of status. The taller the hat, the higher the social standing of the wearer. In fact, certain sumptuary laws in places like Burgundy restricted how high these hats could be, depending on your class. A woman of the nobility might flaunt a hennin that towered over everyone else, while someone of lower rank was expected to keep her headwear modest. Still, that didn't stop ambitious ladies from stretching the rules, sometimes literally. Chroniclers of the time poked fun at women teetering under the weight of their towering hats, comparing them to chimneys, funnels, or even church spires. But hennins were not the only extravagant hats to appear in medieval Europe. In England and France, women also wore heart-shaped headdresses, known as escalope styles, where stiffened fabric curved outward from the sides of the head to form large, wing-like shapes. These were then covered in veils or gauzy fabric, creating a surreal silhouette that framed the face dramatically. To our modern eyes, they might look almost like costume pieces from a fantasy film, yet in their own time, they represented elegance and refinement. Men, too, embraced unusual headgear. Among the wealthy, large chaperons became fashionable. Originally a simple hood with a long tail, the chaperon evolved into something elaborate. The tail, called a liripipe, could be wrapped, knotted, or draped in different ways, turning what began as a practical hood into a versatile fashion statement. Nobles would wear their chaperons with the liripipe hanging dramatically over one shoulder, sometimes wrapped several times around the head like a turban. It was fashionable, but also heavy and unwieldy, and some paintings of the time show men looking slightly uncomfortable beneath the folds. Then there were the hats designed, not so much for beauty as for shock and spectacle. In certain courtly festivities, nobles wore headpieces shaped like ships, castles, or crowns, decorated with feathers and jewels. These were less everyday wear and more theatrical costume, but they underline how much the head was seen as a canvas for expression. The Middle Ages also had its share of practical headgear that became fashionable, despite, or perhaps because of, its oddity. For instance, straw hats and felt caps were common among peasants and workers, protecting them from the sun in the fields. Yet in the right hands, even a simple straw hat could be adorned with ribbons or dyed fabrics to create something eye-catching. Among soldiers, helmets often doubled as a kind of fashion statement. Crests and plumes were attached not only for battlefield recognition, but also to impress during parades and tournaments. A knight riding with a great plume of dyed feathers rising from his helmet must have looked every bit as flamboyant as a noblewoman balancing a hennin. Of course, as with cosmetics, the clergy often disapproved of such excess. Monks and priests complained that these towering hats were vanity at its worst, likening them to symbols of pride and folly. Satirical poets of the time mocked both men and women for turning their heads into displays of arrogance. Yet just as with long shoes or trailing gowns, the criticisms only seemed to fuel the popularity of the trend. It's also worth noting that headgear was not just a matter of fashion. It often conveyed meaning. Certain colors or shapes could signify marital status, wealth, or regional identity. A veil might indicate a married woman, while a flamboyant hennin could mark someone as not only noble, but also fashion-conscious. Hats were not worn in isolation. They were deeply tied to the social fabric of medieval life. Looking back, medieval headgear appears both comical and breathtaking. To imagine someone walking carefully through the narrow streets of a medieval town, balancing a hennin taller than their own torso, or a man adjusting the many folds of his chaperon before entering a banquet hall, is to be reminded that fashion has always flirted with impracticality. It is less about convenience and more about making an impression. The towering hats and wild headgear of the Middle Ages may seem laughable to us now, but they also reveal a timeless truth. Humans have always used fashion as a way to elevate themselves, sometimes quite literally. Next, we'll explore another curious side of medieval appearance in Section 8, Hairstyles and Hair Mysteries, where hair itself became both a symbol and a battlefield for creativity. Section 8, Hairstyles and Hair Mysteries. When you think of medieval fashion, towering hennins, flowing gowns, or curling shoes might spring to mind first. But hair itself was no less important in shaping identity, beauty, and status. In fact, hair was often seen as a person's natural crown, and the way it was styled, or deliberately hidden, spoke volumes about who they were. In the Middle Ages, hair was a canvas for social messages, creative expression, and sometimes even religious symbolism, with trends that could seem elegant, bizarre, or downright impractical to us today. Let us begin with women's hairstyles, which were deeply tied to ideas of modesty and virtue. For much of the early Middle Ages, it was expected that married women would cover their hair entirely with veils, wimples, or hoods. Exposed hair could be seen as provocative or vain, so it was often hidden in public. Yet this did not stop women from styling their hair elaborately underneath these coverings. Long braids were particularly popular, and many noblewomen had their hair braided, coiled, or looped around the ears before tucking it under veils. Some braids were decorated with ribbons or beads, giving a sense of luxury even when partially concealed. By the later Middle Ages, especially in courts across France and Burgundy, hairstyles became much bolder. One striking trend was the fashion of plucking the hairline. Women would remove or thin the hair at the front of the head, creating a high, rounded forehead that was considered the height of elegance. To us, it might look as though someone had accidentally shaved off part of their hairline, but in their world, it was a deliberate mark of beauty. This look was often paired with elaborate headdresses or hennins, giving the face an elongated, almost otherworldly appearance. Braids remained a constant throughout the centuries, but how they were worn varied dramatically. Some women wound their braids around their head like a crown, fastening them with pins or ribbons. Others let them hang long, decorated with strips of colored cloth, sometimes even threaded with gold wire. Wealthier ladies might employ servants to help braid their hair into intricate patterns, a process that could take hours. To keep hair shiny and smooth, oils and herbal rinses were applied, often infused with rosemary, chamomile, or lavender. These not only softened the hair, but left it pleasantly fragrant, a natural medieval perfume. Men, too, paid great attention to their hair. In the early medieval period, shoulder-length hair and full beards were common among kings and warriors, seen as symbols of strength and virility. The Frankish king Charlemagne, for instance, was often described in chronicles as having thick, flowing hair and beard, which added to his imposing presence. But by the High Middle Ages, clean-shaven faces and shorter hair became fashionable among noblemen, reflecting ideals of chivalry and refinement. Knights in particular often favored neatly cropped hair, which was easier to wear under helmets. That being said, fashions varied widely by region. In England during the 12th century, young men grew their hair long and curled it into ringlets, a style that some church officials harshly criticized as effeminate. One monk complained that men spent more time with curling irons than women did, a reminder that vanity was not confined to one gender. In contrast, monastic orders embraced the tonsure, the practice of shaving the top of the head while leaving a fringe of hair around it. This marked a monk's religious devotion, but also became a recognizable style associated with humility and renunciation. To the modern eye, it might look rather odd, almost like a natural bald spot exaggerated, but to contemporaries, it symbolized spiritual dedication. Children's hairstyles were another world entirely. Young boys and girls often wore their hair long and loose until a certain age, when their first haircut marked a symbolic passage into maturity. For noble children, these haircuts could be ceremonial events, accompanied by feasts or blessings. Girls might then begin wearing veils or braids, while boys had their hair trimmed in line with their father's fashion. In some places, young boys even wore a small lock of hair left uncut, tied with a ribbon, as a charm or symbol of youth. Hair could also serve as a political or cultural statement. During the Norman conquest of England, for example, chroniclers noted that Norman men wore their hair cropped short at the back, while Anglo-Saxons favored longer locks. The contrast became so pronounced that it was sometimes used to distinguish friend from foe. Similarly, in Byzantine-influenced areas, elaborate curls and oiled hair reflected the sophistication of the empire, setting their wearers apart from more rugged Western Europeans. Even within households, hair care was an important ritual. Combs were prized possessions, often carved from wood, ivory, or bone, and used not just for styling, but for removing lice, a constant concern in medieval life. Noble families might own beautifully decorated combs, sometimes inlaid with silver, which served as both practical tools and luxury items. Washing hair was less frequent than today, but when it was done, it often involved herbal concoctions believed to promote growth or prevent illness. Recipes survive that recommend boiling herbs like nettles or sage in vinegar or wine, and then using the liquid as a rinse. There was also a mystical side to medieval hair. Locks of hair were sometimes kept as tokens of love, braided into jewelry, or tied around the arm. Cutting someone's hair without their permission could be seen as an insult, even an attack on their honor. In folklore, hair was thought to carry part of a person's essence, so burning or burying cut hair was common to prevent it from being used in spells or curses. Looking at these many variations, it's clear that hair in the Middle Ages was far more than just a practical matter. It was a stage on which identity, beauty, and even power were performed. To pluck your hairline high, to braid golden ribbons into your locks, or to shave your head in devotion, all were choices that spoke louder than words. As amusing as some of these styles may appear today, they remind us that humans across history have always found ways to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, even with something as simple as hair. Section 9. Jewelry and accessories gone wild. If clothing and hairstyles in the Middle Ages made bold statements, jewelry and accessories pushed the message even further. A noble's wardrobe wasn't considered complete without glittering ornaments to signal wealth, faith, or even allegiance. For people of status, accessories weren't just decoration. They were declarations, symbols worn on the body for everyone to see. Some of them were breathtaking in their artistry, while others seem almost over the top or even uncomfortable to imagine wearing. Gold, silver, and precious stones were the most obvious signs of wealth. Rings were particularly popular, worn not just on fingers, but sometimes threaded onto belts or necklaces. For nobles, rings were more than pretty objects. They were tools of authority. Seals carved into the metal allowed lords, bishops, and even kings to stamp their letters with wax, authenticating their commands. To lose one's seal ring could be disastrous, like losing both an identity card and a signature at once. But beyond their practical use, rings often gleamed with sapphires, garnets, or pearls, catching the light in candlelit halls and banquets. Necklaces, too, were common, though they ranged from simple chains to intricate pendants encrusted with jewels. Religious pendants, crosses, relics, or medallions of saints were especially treasured. For the devout, wearing such an item was thought to protect the wearer's soul and body. In some cases, tiny relics, such as a fragment of a saint's bone or cloth, were embedded inside lockets, turning jewelry into miniature shrines. But in noble courts, the pendants could also be ostentatious, glittering so brightly that they were impossible to ignore. Brooches and pins held cloaks together and provided another chance for extravagance. Crafted in circular or star-like shapes, these brooches could be made of gold, enamel, or even glass. Many were so large that they became focal points of the outfit. Some were engraved with mottos or coats of arms, making them less of a trinket and more of a portable billboard for one's family pride. Even everyday folk sometimes wore simple brooches of bronze or pewter, showing that accessories weren't entirely reserved for the elite. Belts were another unexpected canvas for fashion. Noblemen and ladies often wore belts decorated with metalwork, gemstones, or embroidered fabric. The ends of belts, sometimes tipped with ornate clasps or golden studs, would dangle dramatically at the hip. For women, belts could cinch in flowing gowns, emphasizing the waist. For men, richly decorated belts signaled martial readiness and noble status. Some belts even carried charms or amulets, thought to protect against illness or bad luck. One of the strangest accessories, however, was the use of chaperones, a type of hood that became increasingly exaggerated. At first practical, the chaperone grew into a fashion statement with long, dangling tails that could be wrapped like scarves or left trailing to the ground. The absurdity of these oversized hoods became so pronounced that satirical writers of the time mocked nobles for their impractical tastes. To us, they might resemble a medieval version of streetwear taken too far, an everyday item stretched into something more about appearance than purpose. Earrings, surprisingly, were less common in much of medieval Europe, as covered hair and headwear often obscured the ears. But bracelets and arm rings were fashionable among both men and women, especially in regions influenced by Viking or Byzantine traditions. Some were thick, coiled bands of silver, worn almost like armor for the wrist. Others were delicate gold links that jingled lightly when the wearer moved. Beyond mere beauty, many accessories carried superstitions. Amulets were hidden in jewelry, tiny carved stones, engraved prayers, or herbs tucked into hollow pendants. These were thought to protect against headaches, evil spirits, or even poisoning. One particularly curious belief held that certain gemstones could change color in the presence of danger, acting almost like an early warning system. Whether or not they actually worked, they provided comfort to those who wore them. But while jewelry was dazzling, it also revealed the growing anxieties about class. Laws known as sumptuary regulations often tried to restrict who could wear what. A merchant's wife might be forbidden to wear pearls, for instance, while only nobles could adorn themselves with specific colors of enamel or cloth of gold belts. These rules were often broken, of course, but they reveal how accessories weren't just personal, they were political. Wearing the wrong jewelry could spark envy, resentment, or even legal trouble. Children, too, sometimes had their share of accessories. Wealthy families might give them small pendants or charms to wear for protection. In some households, these charms included carved teeth, tiny bells, or animal bones, believed to ward off harm. While these may sound odd to us, they reflect the universal desire of parents to keep their children safe in uncertain times. By the end of the Middle Ages, accessories reached dizzying heights of extravagance. The courts of Burgundy and France saw nobles dripping with gold chains, jeweled brooches the size of a fist, and belts so heavy they seemed impractical. Even shoes and gloves were embroidered with pearls or gold thread, making every inch of the body a stage for wealth. To dress without such accessories would have seemed almost naked to a courtier. Proof that fashion was as much about display as it was about comfort. When we look at these medieval accessories, from glittering rings to absurdly long hoods, we see not just decoration but identity. Each jewel, clasp, or belt whispered something about who the wearer was, or who they wanted to be. And while some of it strikes us as impractical or even embarrassing today, it reminds us that humans have always loved to adorn themselves, to stand out, and to shine. Section 10. Perfumes, Makeup, and Body Fashion. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often leap to castles, armor, and long sweeping gowns. But another world thrived alongside those images, the world of scent, cosmetics, and the delicate and sometimes questionable art of grooming. While fashion on the outside declared wealth and identity, the body itself became a canvas for status and taste. Some trends were charming, others bizarre, and a few rather embarrassing by modern standards. Perfume, for instance, played a vital role in medieval life. Cities were crowded, sanitation was minimal, and unpleasant smells lingered in daily life. Fragrance offered not only relief, but also refinement. Wealthy nobles imported exotic perfumes from the East, blends of rosewater, musk, ambergris, and spices. To dab oneself with these scents was to carry a mark of sophistication. Small pomanders, little balls of silver or gold filled with aromatic herbs, could be worn at the waist or hung from a chain around the neck. With each step, the pomander released a delicate fragrance, masking less pleasant odors. Imagine walking into a crowded banquet hall and catching the faint trail of cloves, cinnamon, or rose as a noble woman passed by. It was a performance as much as a precaution. Makeup, too, carried its own set of fashions and oddities. Pale skin was prized throughout much of the Middle Ages, as it suggested that one did not labor outdoors. Women, and sometimes men, used powders made of ground alabaster, rice flour, or even lead to lighten their complexion. Lead-based cosmetics, though popular, were harmful, gradually damaging the skin and health of those who relied on them. Rouge, made from crushed berries or minerals, added color to the cheeks, while eyebrows were carefully shaped or even plucked entirely. Depending on the fashion of the century, in some courts, the removal of the hairline was also considered beautiful. Women would shave or pluck their foreheads to create a higher, more refined brow. To our eyes, it may seem peculiar, but in its time, it was a sign of elegance. The pursuit of beauty didn't stop at the face. Teeth, for example, were sometimes darkened deliberately with herbs or powders, especially in regions influenced by foreign customs. While white teeth became fashionable later, in certain circles during the Middle Ages, darker teeth carried their own allure, though to us it might appear less than appealing. Meanwhile, breath fresheners were common. Little lozenges made of spices, mint, or anise were chewed during feasts to sweeten the breath. These tiny details revealed just how aware medieval people were of their personal presence. Hair and grooming formed another part of body fashion. Long, flowing hair was admired for both men and women, though styles varied dramatically across regions and centuries. In some courts, men curled their hair or wore it shoulder length, while women often plaited and braided their locks into elaborate shapes, sometimes weaving ribbons or jewels into them. Wigs, though not as common as in later centuries, did appear occasionally, especially among nobles wishing to conceal thinning hair or enhance their appearance for special occasions. Hair oils, made from herbs or animal fats, were used to add shine and manageability, though the scents may not always have been pleasant. Perhaps one of the more peculiar aspects of body fashion was the use of false beauty aids. Some noblewomen reportedly painted veins onto their skin with blue dye to emphasize the paleness and translucence of their complexion. This practice gave the impression of delicate, almost otherworldly skin, which was highly prized. In certain courts, beauty spots, small dots of paint applied to the face, were also worn, though not as elaborately as in later centuries. These tiny marks, often positioned on the cheek or forehead, carried symbolic meaning, signaling flirtation or status. Fragrance returned again in the form of baths and scented waters. While not all medieval people had access to frequent bathing, nobles sometimes indulged in perfumed baths, where rose petals, herbs, and spices floated on the water. These were both luxurious and medicinal, as many believed herbs like lavender or rosemary could heal the body as well as refresh the spirit. After bathing, scented cloths or powders were dabbed onto the skin. Even clothing was sometimes infused with fragrance. Linen undergarments, washed and scented, helped nobles feel fresher beneath their heavy outer garments. Of course, not all trends aged gracefully. Some cosmetics caused irritation or illness, perfumes could be overpowering, and extreme grooming practices often bordered on the absurd. The desire for pale skin, for instance, not only excluded those with darker complexions, but also drove people to dangerous chemicals. Shaved hairlines or painted veins may seem comical to us today, but at the time, they were considered the height of refinement. What stands out most is how similar these practices feel to our own, despite the centuries between us. Perfume, makeup, and grooming have always been about more than hygiene or aesthetics. They are about identity, confidence, and expression. In a medieval court, the faint trail of rosewater, the shimmering glow of powdered skin, or the intricate braid tied with a jeweled ribbon all told a story. I am wealthy, I am refined, I belong. When we think of embarrassing fashion trends, we might chuckle at the painted veins or the dangerously toxic powders, but behind them lies a universal truth. People of every age seek to transform themselves, to become something greater through the art of fashion and self-presentation. And in the candlelit halls of the Middle Ages, where scent and sight mingled together, the body itself was as much a fashion statement as any gown, tunic, or headdress. Section 11. Footwear and the oddities of medieval shoes. In the Middle Ages, shoes were much more than mere protection for the feet. They were a reflection of status, fashion, and sometimes downright creativity. While today we may think of footwear as practical, medieval shoes could be extravagant, bizarre, or even dangerous. Nobles, merchants, and peasants alike relied on shoes to navigate streets, fields, and courts, but the styles varied dramatically depending on wealth, region, and social standing. One of the most famous trends in medieval Europe was the poulain, or pointed shoe. These shoes, especially popular in the 14th and 15th centuries, featured extremely long toes that sometimes extended several inches beyond the actual foot. The longer the toe, the more fashionable the shoe was considered. It is said that the nobility would stuff the ends of the shoes with moss, wool, or fabric to maintain the shape. Some toes were so long that nobles needed servants to help them walk without tripping. Imagine walking through a crowded market or a stone-paved street with a foot stretched unnaturally forward. It required balance, grace, and perhaps a touch of daring. For women, high heels were occasionally introduced, though they were different from the modern versions. Some heels were built to elevate the wearer, literally lifting them above mud, dust, and dirt on the streets. These elevated shoes allowed the fine fabrics of gowns to remain clean, though they often made walking more precarious. Shoes became more than mere tools. They became statements of refinement, signaling that the wearer could afford to move through life with elegance rather than practicality. Boots, of course, were popular for both men and women in certain regions, particularly in colder climates. Leather boots protected against damp streets, rough paths, and snow. Yet even boots could become expressive. Some were decorated with stitching, dyed leather, or metal clasps, and occasionally The tops were folded over or turned down to showcase the material inside. In military contexts, boots were sturdy, sometimes reinforced with additional layers of leather or even metal studs. Footwear in this sense served both fashion and function. Peasants and workers, in contrast, wore simpler shoes, often made from a single piece of leather and crudely stitched. These shoes were functional, designed for durability rather than style. Even so, they occasionally featured small decorative touches, a bit of colored stitching, a simple buckle, or a carved toe, to personalize the otherwise plain footwear. Shoes, even at the lowest social levels, reflected both necessity and a sense of identity. Beyond practical and decorative purposes, shoes were also associated with rituals and beliefs. Certain charms were sometimes sewn into shoes to ward off evil spirits or bring good luck. In some regions, it was customary to wear shoes with specific colors or patterns on holy days or festivals. Shoes were even used symbolically in legal matters. In some medieval courts, a shoe thrown down could signal a challenge or dispute. The way one walked, the style of one's footwear, and the condition of the shoes could all communicate messages about status, character, and intention. Some medieval shoes were less about fashion and more about performance or spectacle. In courtly dances or theatrical performances, footwear could be exaggerated, adding height, shine, or weight to enhance a costume. Certain shoes featured bells that jingled with every step, filling halls with gentle sound. Other shoes were embroidered or painted to match the lavish fabrics of gowns and doublets, ensuring the entire ensemble worked as a visual symphony. The attention to detail was remarkable, turning the simple act of walking into a statement of taste and refinement. Of course, not all shoe trends were comfortable. The extreme points of poulaines could lead to injury, infections, or even broken toes. Heeled shoes could strain the back and legs, while shoes of rigid leather made long journeys difficult. Yet the desire to signal wealth, taste, and sophistication often outweighed practical concerns. Footwear became a language of status, and anyone wishing to ascend socially had to learn it, sometimes at considerable cost to comfort. For children, footwear was often simpler, but not entirely absent of style. Small leather boots or soft shoes were made to protect little feet, sometimes dyed in bright colors to mimic adult fashion. Some children's shoes featured small bells or decorative stitching, hinting at the playful side of medieval fashion. Even in youth, shoes could convey family status and aspirations. As centuries passed, the medieval fascination with exaggerated footwear eventually waned, giving way to more practical and refined designs in the Renaissance. Yet the legacy of these imaginative shoes remains, reminding us of a time when fashion was an adventure, a declaration, and occasionally a risk. From pointed poulaines to ornate boots, medieval shoes reveal the creativity, values, and social rules of a world very different from our own. Looking closely at these footwear trends, we see more than odd shapes or daring decorations. Each pair of shoes tells a story of wealth, aspiration, or cultural identity. Even the humble peasant shoe, carefully stitched and worn, represents a person's place in a complex social structure. Fashion, it seems, has always been more than clothing. It is communication, a reflection of who we are and how we wish to be seen. Medieval shoes, for all their oddities, remind us of the inventiveness and imagination of the people who wore them. They reveal a culture fascinated by appearance, identity, and the subtle language of style. The streets of the Middle Ages were alive with color, texture, and sound, each footstep part of a larger, ever-changing tapestry of fashion. And while some trends may seem ridiculous or uncomfortable today, they also speak to the human desire to create, adorn, and express oneself, even at the level of the feet. Section 12. Jewelry, Accessories, and Ornamentation. In the Middle Ages, clothing was only part of the story. Accessories and jewelry elevated outfits into statements of wealth, identity, and taste. From glittering brooches to delicate chains, medieval men and women adorned themselves with a variety of objects that served both decorative and symbolic purposes. In a world without photography or mass media, these ornaments communicated status, alliances, and even personal beliefs in subtle and sometimes surprising ways. Brooches, for instance, were not merely functional. While many secured cloaks or tunics, they also displayed intricate craftsmanship. Precious metals, gold and silver, were often engraved with patterns, symbols, or heraldic designs. Gems such as garnets, sapphires, or emeralds were set into the metal, catching light and drawing the eye. Even simpler brooches could convey identity. The shape, size, or positioning could indicate marital status, social rank, or allegiance to a particular noble house. Imagine a noblewoman walking through a sunlit hall, her cloak fastened with a gleaming brooch, reflecting sunlight in dozens of tiny sparks. It was both elegance and communication. Rings were equally significant. While today, rings often symbolize marriage, in the Middle Ages, they had multiple roles. Some were purely decorative, while others were seals used to stamp wax on documents, representing authority and authenticity. Signet rings, engraved with personal or family symbols, allowed nobles to leave an unmistakable mark on letters or legal contracts. Rings could also carry talismanic properties. People believed certain gemstones could bring protection, health, or fortune. Wearing a ruby to attract love or a sapphire for wisdom was a practice rooted in both fashion and belief. Necklaces and chains further added to personal ornamentation. Long chains of gold or silver were popular among men and women alike, often worn with pendants that ranged from religious symbols to charms of luck. Religious pendants, like crosses or small reliquaries, were both spiritual and decorative, showing devotion while enhancing attire. Some chains were elaborate, crafted with multiple layers, tiny charms, or enamel work, turning the neck into a living display of artistry. As people moved through courts, streets, and marketplaces, the clinking of chains and glitter of jewels made each step part of a visual and auditory presentation. Belts and girdles were another versatile accessory. Beyond holding clothing in place, they could be highly decorative. Leather belts were often embossed, dyed, or adorned with metal fittings. Nobles sometimes fastened small pouches, knives, or keys to their belts, blending utility with style. Girdles for women were frequently embroidered with gold thread or studded with tiny gems, winding delicately around the waist. These accessories emphasized posture, silhouette, and even social distinction. A heavily ornamented belt could indicate wealth, while a simpler version might reflect modesty or practicality. Gloves, too, became a canvas for expression. While initially functional, gloves evolved into decorative items worn for fashion and status. Embroidered, lined with fur, or trimmed with precious metals, gloves could indicate the wearer's refinement. In some courts, certain colors or styles were reserved for royalty or specific nobility, creating a subtle language of authority. Even small differences in stitching or length could signal rank or allegiance, showing how deeply fashion and hierarchy intertwined. Headdresses and hair accessories added yet another layer of ornamentation. Women's hairstyles were frequently enhanced with ribbons, combs, and jeweled pins. These pins might be long, slender, and gold, or short and embedded with pearls. Men, too, used simple circlets or hairbands to show status or allegiance. Some aristocratic women wore hennins, tall, conical hats often supported with wires, veils, and chains of gems. Walking through a festival or procession with these headpieces required balance and grace, and the sight would have been mesmerizing, combining architecture, fashion, and movement into one living spectacle. Even footwear could be ornamented. Nobles' shoes were not limited to shape. They often featured embroidery, small gems, or metallic threads. Bells on shoes created soft, jingling sounds as people walked, while embroidered patterns reflected wealth and taste. Every detail of a shoe could complement a brooch, belt, or pendant, creating a coordinated ensemble that told a story about the wearer. Beyond jewelry and accessories, some people wore symbolic or talismanic charms. Tiny amulets in the shape of animals, plants, or mystical symbols were popular. These charms were believed to protect the wearer, attract fortune, or provide health benefits. Hanging them from necklaces, belts, or even shoes transformed fashion into a subtle form of superstition and self-expression. What makes medieval ornamentation particularly fascinating is the intersection of beauty, utility, and meaning. Each object, whether a ring, chain, glove, or belt, was carefully chosen, placed, and often imbued with purpose beyond mere decoration. These accessories were small, but they conveyed powerful messages about social hierarchy, personal taste, and cultural norms. Through brooches, chains, belts, gloves, and headdresses, medieval people communicated without words. They expressed wealth, skill, taste, and even spiritual devotion, using fashion as a subtle, elegant language. The art of accessorizing was a dance of light, color, texture, and symbolism. Walking through a medieval town or court, one would notice glimmering rings, jingling shoes, and gleaming chains, each detail creating a quiet, constant conversation between the wearer and those around them. The beauty of these practices lies not just in extravagance, but in intention. Every accessory told a story, marked a status, or carried a wish or prayer. Even the simplest ornament, an embroidered glove, a small pendant, a leather belt, was part of a broader world of visual communication. Medieval people understood that fashion, when combined with accessories, could transform ordinary attire into a statement of identity and artistry. Ultimately, jewelry and adornments were more than decoration. They were an extension of personality, a reflection of culture, and a form of expression. In quiet, deliberate steps, the medieval wearer communicated elegance, status, and taste. The streets, halls, and courts became a gallery of moving art, where every chain, ring, and brooch contributed to a living tapestry of fashion, meaning, and history. Section 13. Dining etiquette and tableware in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, meals were more than just nourishment. They were events that reflected social structure, culture, and personal refinement. From the grand halls of nobility to the modest homes of peasants, the way people ate and the utensils they used told stories about wealth, status, and tradition. Dining involved careful attention to detail, from seating arrangements to the use of tableware, creating an atmosphere that was both functional and ceremonial. At the tables of nobles, meals were often elaborate, with multiple courses served in sequence. Tableware was a reflection of status. Plates and bowls could be made from wood, pottery, or, for the wealthy, precious metals such as silver and gold. Knives were common, while spoons were widely used, but forks were rare and considered a novelty in many regions. The absence or presence of certain utensils, along with their material, signaled the wealth and refinement of the household. Dining etiquette was precise. Nobles were expected to wash hands before meals, often using basins brought to the table, though a communal cloth might also serve for hand wiping. Napkins, though simple, were used to maintain cleanliness, and guests were observed for their ability to eat neatly and politely. Table manners were a reflection of character and upbringing, and missteps could affect reputation. In this way, dining became a subtle performance of refinement, a quiet demonstration of discipline and taste. Seating arrangements followed strict rules. The head of the household, or the most esteemed guest, occupied the central position at the table, with others seated according to hierarchy. Proximity to the host was a signal of favor or status, and guests were mindful of their placement. Meals were often shared in silence or accompanied by gentle conversation, allowing diners to focus on the subtleties of taste, presentation, and company. Food itself varied according to class and season. Nobles enjoyed meats such as venison, poultry, and fish, often seasoned with imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. Vegetables and fruits complemented the meal, though these were less prominent for the wealthy than protein-rich dishes. For peasants, meals relied more on grains, legumes, and seasonal produce, sometimes supplemented with cheese or small amounts of meat. Despite these differences, the principles of table etiquette applied across social classes, emphasizing order and respect. Table settings were often carefully arranged. Plates, bowls, and cups were positioned deliberately, and food was sometimes served on communal platters. Each diner took portions with care, avoiding waste and showing consideration for others. For nobles, the presentation of dishes could be a spectacle, with elaborate garnishes, folded pastries, or decorative carving. Even the arrangement of a simple meal reflected an understanding of aesthetics and order. Drinking vessels varied as well. Goblets of wood, horn, or metal were common, with the wealthy often using silver cups adorned with intricate designs. Wine was a staple for those who could afford it, while ale or small beer was more typical among peasants. Drinking etiquette mattered. Lifting the cup with the right hand, toasting with care, and sipping without haste were all part of a refined approach to meals. Shared cups or communal drinking vessels were sometimes used in less wealthy households, emphasizing practicality over ceremony. Napkins, though simple, were functional and sometimes decorated. Guests were expected to use them discreetly, wiping hands and lips without drawing attention. The act of eating quietly, using the utensils correctly, and handling the tableware with care was a form of silent communication, conveying respect for both food and company. Meals were, in this way, a practice of self-control, refinement, and awareness. Utensils themselves had subtle variations. Knives could be pointed or rounded, sometimes used for both cutting and spearing. Spoons varied in depth and shape, accommodating soups, stews, or porridge. Each tool was chosen for its practicality, and in wealthier households, for its aesthetic value. Even minor differences, such as the curvature of a spoon or the length of a knife blade, were noticed and appreciated by discerning diners. The overall atmosphere of medieval dining was intentionally calm and deliberate. Meals were paced slowly, allowing conversation, digestion, and appreciation of both food and company. Kitchens were separate from dining halls, so the aromas and activity of cooking did not disturb the serenity of the table. Candles or simple lanterns provided gentle illumination, adding warmth and a peaceful ambiance to the ritual. Children were often included in meals, learning the social rules of dining from an early age. They observed their elders, noting how to handle utensils, where to sit, and how to respond politely to conversation. In this way, dining etiquette served as a training ground for future social participation, combining instruction with subtle immersion in cultural norms. In essence, dining in the Middle Ages was both nourishment and ceremony. The careful selection of tableware, attention to seating, and refined use of utensils transformed ordinary meals into exercises of grace, patience, and observation. Even the simplest dishes, when approached with care, contributed to a sense of order, rhythm, and quiet beauty. Through these practices, medieval life reveals a deep understanding of the human desire for structure, aesthetics, and respectful interaction. Every utensil, cup, and plate played a role in a larger choreography of meals, illustrating how food could nourish not only the body, but also social bonds, manners, and cultural identity. Section 14. Festivals, Entertainment, and Public Gatherings. In the Middle Ages, life was not only about work, religion, and daily routines. There were also moments of joy, celebration, and communal gathering. Festivals and public events offered breaks from ordinary life, providing spaces for social interaction, entertainment, and shared experiences. These gatherings were integral to the rhythm of medieval communities, and they reflected culture, belief, and creativity in ways that were both subtle and striking. Festivals often coincided with religious holidays or seasonal changes. Celebrations such as Christmas, Easter, and harvest festivals brought entire villages together. Streets would be decorated with garlands, banners, and simple adornments made from flowers, herbs, and colored fabrics. The visual impact of a decorated village square or churchyard was calming yet festive, creating a sense of community while signaling the significance of the occasion. Even in the quieter moments of preparation, there was anticipation and gentle activity, a rhythm that connected people across ages and classes. Markets often formed a central part of these festivals. Merchants set up stalls with textiles, food, small crafts, and sometimes curious items from distant regions. Children would watch performers, jugglers, or acrobats, absorbing the sights and sounds with wide-eyed attention. Bells from churches and the soft murmur of conversations created a peaceful, immersive atmosphere. While the events were lively, the gentle cadence of music, footsteps, and laughter contributed to a serene environment rather than chaotic noise. Entertainment in festivals ranged from music and dance to storytelling and pageantry. Minstrels performed songs with lutes, harps, and flutes, filling the air with melodies that were both soothing and engaging. Storytellers recounted legends, historical events, and folk tales, capturing imaginations while preserving cultural memory. The sound of these performances, calmly spoken tales, rhythmic music, and occasional laughter added texture to medieval life, offering a quiet excitement that was reflective rather than overwhelming. Dances were an important part of communal celebrations. People formed circles, lines, or pairs, moving together in time with music. While some dances were simple and repetitive, designed for communal participation, others involved intricate steps that displayed skill and elegance. Watching dancers move gracefully across the square, coordinating steps with neighbors, created a sense of harmony. The gentle rhythm of feet on cobblestones, combined with flowing garments, produced an understated beauty, connecting performers and audience in shared experience. Pageantry and parades were common in larger towns and cities. Nobles, guilds, and religious organizations would organize processions with banners, decorated wagons, and costumed participants. These events celebrated specific occasions, such as royal visits, victories, or saints' days. While the spectacle was visually striking, it unfolded at a slow and deliberate pace, allowing the crowd to absorb every detail: the sparkle of metals, the flutter of fabrics, the careful arrangement of flowers. This careful choreography created calm admiration rather than frantic excitement. Games and competitions often accompanied festivals. Archery contests, jousting displays, and other forms of sport provided entertainment and an opportunity for skill demonstration. Participants prepared carefully, and observers watched attentively, appreciating technique, precision, and courage. Even in competition, the atmosphere could remain contemplative, with moments of quiet observation punctuated by gentle applause or cheers. The structure and ritual of these activities contributed to a sense of order and shared appreciation. Food played a special role in festival gatherings. Vendors offered simple treats such as bread, cheese, dried fruits, or small pastries. In wealthier communities, feasts might include roasted meats, pies, and delicacies prepared with spices imported from afar. The aroma of cooking mingled with the scents of fresh flowers and herbs, creating a sensory tapestry that was both soothing and appetizing. Eating in a festival setting was communal, emphasizing togetherness and shared enjoyment rather than indulgence alone. Religious ceremonies we intertwined with entertainment in many festivals. Church bells signaled the beginning of events, and processions often included prayers, hymns, and blessings. People participated in rituals with calm reverence, acknowledging spiritual traditions while remaining part of the communal celebration. The blending of sacred and secular activities created a balanced rhythm, alternating between moments of quiet reflection and gentle amusement. Crafts and workshops often featured during festivals, especially in towns with skilled artisans. Demonstrations of weaving, metalwork, pottery, or embroidery allowed visitors to observe the creation of useful and beautiful objects. Watching an artisan work, with measured movements and attention to detail, could be mesmerizing. The calm repetition of techniques and the transformation of raw materials into finished pieces offered a contemplative pleasure that complemented the lively aspects of festivals. Children played games designed for both fun and learning. Simple toys, mock battles, and cooperative activities kept young participants engaged while introducing them to cultural norms and skills. The laughter of children, mingled with the melodic sounds of music and conversation, created a gentle background hum, enhancing the overall atmosphere without overwhelming it. These moments of play were subtle lessons in social behavior, observation, and patience. Overall, medieval festivals and public gatherings were layered experiences. They combined music, dance, storytelling, food, religious ritual, and crafts into a harmonious whole. Movement, sound, and scent were carefully balanced, creating environments that were immersive and calming while still capturing attention. Participants absorbed details gradually, savoring the rhythm of communal life and leaving the events with a quiet sense of belonging and memory. The beauty of these gatherings lay in their ability to connect individuals to community, tradition, and culture without overwhelming the senses. Each festival was a miniature reflection of society, orderly, rhythmic, and full of subtle details. Through music, dance, storytelling, processions, and communal food, medieval people experienced connection, delight, and cultural continuity. In these moments, the Middle Ages reveal a careful orchestration of life, where celebration was not loud chaos, but a calm, sensory immersion in human creativity, cooperation, and expression. Section 15. Work, Rest, and Reflection in the Middle Ages. Life in the Middle Ages was structured around cycles of work, rest, and reflection. Each day followed a rhythm, guided by the seasons, religious observances, and community needs. People moved through routines that balanced labor with leisure, responsibility with observation, and social interaction with quiet personal reflection. This daily rhythm was an integral part of medieval life, shaping both the external and internal experience of those who lived in towns, villages, and countryside estates. Agricultural work dominated life for most people. Farmers rose with the sun, tending fields and livestock, planting, harvesting, and maintaining tools. The pace was steady, measured by natural cycles rather than strict clocks. Even as labor was necessary and often demanding, there was a contemplative quality to routine tasks. The rhythm of sowing, weeding, and harvesting allowed for observation of nature, awareness of weather patterns, and the satisfaction of seeing small efforts grow into sustenance. Craftsmen and artisans had similarly structured days. Blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and carpenters performed their trades with patience and precision. Work involved both skill and creativity, and each action was deliberate. The process of shaping metal, spinning thread, or carving wood was immersive. The measured sounds of hammers, looms, or chisels created a gentle, repetitive background, and those who practiced these trades often moved in a quiet, focused rhythm, attentive to detail and outcome. Daily labor was punctuated by rest. Meals provided breaks for nourishment and reflection. Simple bread, cheese, soups, and seasonal vegetables were common fare. Drinking water, ale, or milk accompanied meals, offering a moment to pause and observe surroundings. These quiet intervals allowed individuals to reset, breathe, and engage in small talk or reflection. Even short pauses contributed to a calm and steady pace of life, emphasizing balance between exertion and relaxation. Religious observance also structured the day. Prayer, meditation, and participation in church services offered moments of calm focus and contemplation. Monasteries, in particular, were places of rhythm, where chants, reading, and work were interwoven with careful attention to time. The practice of meditation and devotion was not hurried. It was reflective, soothing, and designed to nurture a sense of inner order. The spiritual dimension of daily life provided a gentle counterbalance to physical labor, fostering both calm and mindfulness. Social interaction was another aspect of daily rhythm. People gathered to exchange news, help neighbors, or celebrate milestones. Conversations were often gentle, respectful, and attentive. In villages, communal tasks like threshing, bread making, or mending fences involved collaboration, but also quiet observation and appreciation of skill. In towns, markets allowed for brief social exchanges, where words, gestures, and small favors maintained social cohesion. These interactions were measured, deliberate, and socially enriching. Evening marked a transition to quieter activities. Families gathered by hearths to share stories, repair clothing, or mend tools. The warmth of the fire, the glow of candles, and the gentle sounds of work or conversation created a comforting atmosphere. Children learned through observation, listening to tales of ancestors, legends, or moral lessons. Adults reflected on the day's labor and considered plans for the next. The evening was a slow, immersive period that nurtured both community bonds and personal reflection. Seasonal variations shaped activity and rest. During winter, work slowed as fields lay fallow, and people spent more time indoors. Knitting, spinning, sewing, storytelling, and preparation of food for the months ahead filled the hours. In summer, days were longer, and agricultural or craft labor increased. Awareness of sunlight, temperature, and weather dictated the rhythm of activity, creating a natural cadence that connected people with the environment and its cycles. Even small, repetitive tasks had a meditative quality. Churning butter, tending animals, grinding grain, or weaving fabric could be soothing when approached with patience. The combination of rhythm, tactile sensation, and focus allowed for a quiet mental presence, a slow immersion in the immediate moment. Through these acts, medieval people found calm in the ordinary, subtle beauty in the regular, and satisfaction in practical achievement. Rest was not simply absence of work, it was active reflection. Evening prayers, quiet walks in the yard or fields, or sitting by a window observing nature allowed for contemplation. People noticed the changing light, the shifting colors of leaves, the movement of clouds, or the distant sounds of animals. These observations created a connection to the world beyond immediate tasks, a gentle awareness of time, life, and continuity. Sleep followed these rhythms, restoring body and mind. Bedrooms were simple, with straw mattresses, woolen blankets, or tapestries to ward off chill. The quiet darkness, punctuated by occasional sounds from hearth or street, offered a restorative pause. Dreams were part of reflection, sometimes guiding thought or decision. The calm of night reinforced the gentle flow of daily life, connecting rest to labor and reflection to routine. Through cycles of work, rest, and reflection, medieval life revealed a careful balance. Labor was meaningful, social interaction was deliberate, and quiet moments were intentional. Life was slow, paced by nature and ritual, creating a calm, immersive experience. Even amid hardships, this rhythm offered grounding, structure, and subtle beauty. In essence, daily life in the Middle Ages was a choreography of body, mind, and community. Work, reflection, and rest intertwined with seasons, festivals, and personal routines, forming a pattern that nurtured awareness, patience, and connection. The beauty of this rhythm lies in its simplicity, the gentle attention to details, and the deliberate pacing that allowed people to engage fully with their lives. By observing these practices today, we can imagine the peaceful cadence of a medieval day, where each act, however small, contributed to a quiet, enduring harmony between work, rest, and reflection. And now, as our journey through the Middle Ages comes to a close, allow yourself to drift slowly, like the evening settling over a quiet village square. Let the calm rhythm of daily life, festivals, meals, and reflection from centuries past fill your mind with gentle images. The sounds, scents, and subtle movements of medieval life fade softly, leaving only tranquility. Breathe deeply, feel your body relax, and let the echoes of history guide you toward rest. Sleep now, peacefully, and let the quiet cadence of the past carry you into a calm and gentle night.